The strange thing about power is that the person who holds it rarely has to announce it, and yet on that Tuesday morning at exactly 9:02 a.m., in a glass-walled strategy room overlooking downtown Chicago, a room filled with people who believed they ran everything was about to prove they couldn't even recognize it when it was sitting right in front of them. Security, escort her out, this is a closed-door executive session. The words didn't echo, they sliced, clean and confident, delivered by a man who had never once questioned his place at the head of the table, and every head in the room turned not toward him but toward her, Danielle Brooks, seated quietly at the far end of a 20-foot walnut conference table, dressed in a simple charcoal blazer, no badge, no introduction, no urgency in her posture, just stillness, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. A few screens along the wall displayed quarterly projections in neat, rising lines, numbers that stretched into the hundreds of millions, but no one was looking at them anymore, because the disruption, as they saw it, wasn't the data, it was her. She's not on the attendee list, someone muttered under their breath, just loud enough to be heard, just quiet enough to avoid accountability. A man 2 seats over tapped his tablet, scrolling with irritation as if her presence were a technical glitch he could fix with a swipe. This meeting is for leadership only, another voice added, firmer. This time, and still Danielle didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't defend herself, she simply looked ahead, eyes steady, as if she had already seen how this would play out. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Danielle Brooks, because what no one in that room understood yet was that silence, in the right hands, isn't weakness, it's leverage, and Danielle had spent 20 years mastering exactly that. The man at the head of the table stood now, adjusting his cufflinks as if preparing for something routine, something procedural. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave, he said, slower this time, more deliberate, as if repetition would create authority. A few people shifted in their seats, not uncomfortable enough to speak up, but not entirely at ease either. One junior analyst near the back hesitated, her eyes flicking between Danielle and the meeting agenda on her screen. Something didn't add up. She had seen that name before, she was sure of it, but doubt moved faster than courage in rooms like this, and so she said nothing. Danielle finally moved, but not to stand, not to leave. She reached for the tablet in front of her, calm, precise, as if she were exactly where she was supposed to be, and that was the moment the tension changed, not louder, not explosive, just sharper, like the air itself had realized it was about to be part of something irreversible. The assistant to the chairman had already stepped into the hallway, his voice low but urgent as he spoke into his phone, the word security repeated twice as if saying it faster would make it arrive sooner. Inside the room the tension no longer sat quietly, it pressed against every surface, against the glass walls, against the polished table, against the people who now found themselves watching something they could not easily explain. Danielle Brooks did not follow the movement toward the door. She did not track the call being made on her behalf as if she were the problem to be removed. Instead she shifted her tablet slightly again, and this time the screen lit brighter, not dramatically, not for show, just enough that the reflection of it touched the faces nearest to her, a faint glow that drew the eye without asking for it. This is unnecessary, the chairman said, but his tone had changed, not softer, just less certain, like someone hearing an echo where there should not be one. A man 2 seats down cleared his throat and leaned forward. We have a full agenda and limited time, we cannot let this derail the meeting, he said, trying to pull the room back into structure, back into something predictable, but the structure had already shifted, because Danielle reached out and tapped once more, and this time the wall screens responded, not all at once, but in a sequence so subtle it almost looked like coincidence. One graph flickered, then another minimized, then the central display paused mid-transition as if waiting for instruction that had not yet been given aloud. A few heads turned, confusion replacing irritation. Who is controlling the display? Someone asked, not loudly, but the question landed harder than anything else that had been said so far. The technician near the corner looked down at his console, fingers hovering, then pulling back, because whatever was happening was not coming from him. Danielle did not look at the screens, she did not need to. She simply rested her hands on the table, fingers lightly interlaced, posture unchanged, but the room was no longer reading her as passive, not anymore. the junior analyst finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear enough to break through. Her name was on the agenda this morning, she said, and immediately the weight of that sentence dropped into the room, heavy, undeniable. A few executives turned toward her, some with irritation, others with something closer to concern. That is not possible, the chairman replied quickly. Too quickly. I approved the final list myself, but even as he said it, his eyes flicked toward the central screen, now frozen on a header that no longer matched the printed copies in front of them. Danielle tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, not in defiance, just acknowledgement. Lists change, she said, and the simplicity of it unsettled them more than any argument could have, because it implied control without declaring it, authority without performing it. The door behind them opened softly and the assistant stepped back in, followed by a uniformed building officer who paused just inside the threshold, scanning the room, waiting for direction. The chairman gestured toward Danielle without turning his back on her. That is her, he said, firm again, reclaiming what he believed was the upper ground. The officer took a step forward, professional, measured, but before he could speak, a notification sound echoed from multiple devices around the table, not loud, but synchronized. Phones, tablets, even the wall console chimed in near unison, and that was when the room shifted for the third time, not with noise, not with motion, but with realization beginning to take shape, slow, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. The sound of the notifications did not just interrupt the moment, it rearranged it, every device lighting up with the same subject line, the same timestamp, the same sender, and for a split second no one moved because recognition is slower than reaction when power is involved. The building officer paused mid-step, his attention shifting not to Danielle but to the executives now staring down at their screens. One by one their expressions changed, confusion first, then disbelief, then something closer to quiet alarm. The chairman reached for his phone, his movements sharper now, less controlled, and as he read the message his jaw tightened. What is this? He said, but the question did not land the way he intended. Because no one answered, they were all reading the same thing, an internal notice, clean, official, impossible to ignore, access levels under review, executive privileges temporarily suspended pending system audit, effective immediately. Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she was, hands still resting on the table, posture unchanged, as if the room was finally catching up to a timeline she had already stepped into minutes ago. This has to be a mistake, one executive said, tapping his screen repeatedly as if force could override reality. Another stood halfway from his seat before stopping himself, unsure whether to leave or stay, unsure what either action would mean now. The technician in the corner looked back at his console again, this time not with hesitation but with confusion he could not mask, because the control panel no longer responded to his commands, inputs delayed, permissions denied. The system itself was no longer recognizing the authority it had been programmed to obey. The chairman turned toward Danielle again, but this time the certainty was gone, replaced by something he had not felt in that room in years, uncertainty. Did you do this? He asked, and the question carried less accusation and more need than he realized. Danielle met his gaze evenly, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just clarity. You said this was a closed-door session, she replied, her voice steady, measured. So I closed it. The words did not rise, they settled, heavy and deliberate, and for the first time the room understood that the disruption they had tried to remove had already taken control of the outcome. The building officer lowered his hands slightly, no longer certain who required his presence. The assistant near the door stepped back without being told, instinctively removing himself from a situation that no longer followed the rules he understood. A second wave of notifications followed, faster this time, more direct. Individual access revoked. Shared drives locked, voting rights suspended, the language precise. Corporate, irreversible, 1. By one the people who had minutes ago spoken with unquestioned authority found themselves refreshing screens that no longer recognized them. Danielle finally moved her hands, not dramatically, just enough to slide her tablet back toward herself, reclaiming the space in front of her with the same quiet control she had never surrendered, and in that moment the imbalance was complete. Not because she had raised her voice or demanded attention, but because she had never needed to. The room had not expelled her, it had revealed itself, and now it was standing inside a system that no longer belonged to it. The room did not recover from the second wave of notifications, it fractured, not loudly but completely. Conversations broke into fragments, half-finished sentences and quiet denials, people who had spent years mastering control now tapping screens that no longer answered to them. One executive stood fully this time, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the polished floor. "This is a system error," he insisted, but his voice carried less conviction than it had just minutes earlier. Because the message on his device had not changed, access revoked, credentials suspended, no override available, the language was not vague, it was final. The chairman remained standing at the head of the table, but the posture that once filled the room now looked misplaced, like authority that had not yet realized it had been removed. He turned again to Danielle Brooks, slower this time, measuring her in a way he had refused to before. "You need to explain what is happening," he said, and the shift in his words did not go unnoticed. It was no longer a command, it was a request trying to sound like one. Danielle looked at him, then at the others, her gaze steady, not searching for reactions but acknowledging them as they came. "You asked me to leave a meeting I scheduled," she said, calm, precise, and for a moment the words did not land because they did not fit the version of reality the room had built. One of the board members shook his head slightly, almost involuntarily. "That is not possible," he muttered, but even he did not sound convinced. The junior analyst in the back now leaned forward, eyes wide, the memory clicking into place with clarity she could not ignore anymore. The highlighted name, the override tag, the internal routing code that only appeared on executive-level agendas. She looked down at her screen again, then back up at Danielle, and this time she did not hesitate. "The meeting was initiated from an executive override account," she said, louder now, the words cutting through the remaining denial in the room. A few heads snapped toward her, but she did not shrink back, because the evidence was no longer abstract. It was in front of all of them. Danielle did not interrupt, did not reinforce the statement. She let it stand on its own, because truth, when timed correctly, does not need repetition. The technician spoke next, almost to himself. "That level of access cannot be triggered without primary authorization," his voice low but audible enough, and that was the moment the realization began to settle in layers, slow but undeniable. The chairman's expression tightened, his eyes flicking once toward the screens, then back to Danielle, calculating, re-evaluating, trying to reconcile the woman he had dismissed minutes ago with the system that was now responding to her presence without question. "Who are you?" he asked finally, and the room held that question differently than the ones before, because this time it was not about removal, it was about understanding what they had already lost. Danielle exhaled softly, not out of frustration, not out of relief, but as if marking a transition that had already happened internally before it reached the room. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of her tablet, and when she spoke again her voice did not rise, it settled into the space with quiet certainty. "I am the reason this meeting exists," she said, and the words did not echo, they anchored, locking into place against every assumption that had been made since 9:02 that morning. No one moved immediately after, not because they were frozen, but because movement required clarity. And clarity had just been taken from them. The building officer stepped back fully now. His role dissolved without instruction. The assistant near the door lowered his phone, no longer certain who he would even call, and around the table, the people who had minutes ago controlled budgets, strategies, and entire divisions now sat inside a room that no longer recognized their authority, while Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, not elevated, not announced, just present, as if power had never left her. It had only been waiting for the room to catch up. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt crowded with everything no one had prepared to face, the kind of silence that does not ask for noise but demands recognition. The chairman did not sit down, but he no longer stood like he owned the room. His posture adjusted subtly, shoulders less squared, chin less elevated, as if something invisible had shifted the weight he carried. "That is not how this works," he said finally, but the sentence lacked the structure it needed to hold. Because nothing in the room was working the way it had 5 minutes ago, Danielle Brooks did not interrupt him. She allowed the words to exist, to hang in the air long enough for their weakness to become obvious. Then she reached for her tablet again, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, her fingers moving with familiarity across a system that now refused to answer anyone else. Another notification appeared, this time not on their personal devices but on the main display, the central screen. That had frozen earlier now refreshed, the company crest replaced by a clean interface labeled Executive Governance Review, names began to populate in a column, each one paired with a status indicator that shifted from active to suspended in real time. One by one, the people seated at the table watched their own names appear and change, not in theory, not in speculation, but in visible, undeniable confirmation. "This is unauthorized," one board member said, louder now, attempting to reclaim ground through volume, but the system did not respond to his voice, it responded only to Danielle. The technician stepped back from his console completely, hands raised slightly as if distancing himself from responsibility he could no longer influence. "I do not have access to override this," he admitted, and the admission carried more weight than any argument could have, because it removed the last illusion of control from the room. The junior analyst watched the screen, then Danielle, then back again, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a quiet certainty that felt heavier than fear. She was witnessing something she would not be able to explain to anyone who was not in this room, something that would sound exaggerated if repeated, but undeniable to those who saw it unfold. The chairman took a step closer to the table, his voice lower now, more controlled, not because he had regained authority, but because he was trying to understand where it had gone. "If you initiated this meeting," he said slowly, "then you should have identified yourself." Danielle looked at him, and for the first time there was a slight shift in her expression, not anger, not satisfaction, but something closer to recognition. As if she had heard this reasoning before, not in this room, but in another time, another place. "And if I had," she replied, her voice calm but sharper now, "would you have listened?" The question did not accuse, it exposed, and the room had no immediate answer, because every glance, every word, every decision made since she walked in had already answered it for them. The building officer moved fully aside, now standing near the wall, no longer part of the equation, just another witness to a shift that did not require enforcement. Danielle's gaze moved across the table once more, not scanning for reactions, but marking the moment, as if cataloging it, the hesitation, the denial, the realization, all of it unfolding in sequence exactly as expected. "You removed me from the agenda," she continued, "before you understood who you were removing," and this time the words landed with precision, because the screen behind her confirmed it, the earlier version of the meeting file now visible, her name highlighted at the top, not among the attendees, but above them, listed as originator. The room did not erupt, it did not need to, because the collapse was already complete, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute, and in the center of it, Danielle Brooks remained composed, not rising above the room, but revealing that she had never been beneath it to begin with. No one spoke immediately after the screen revealed the originator line, not because they had nothing to say, but because every possible response felt smaller than the truth now sitting in front of them. The chairman looked at the display longer than anyone else, as if staring at it hard enough might rearrange the outcome, but the text did not flicker, did not adjust, it remained fixed. Danielle Brooks listed above the room. Not within it, not beneath it, above it. "There has to be an error in the system," another executive said, but even he did not believe it anymore, his voice trailing off before the sentence could complete itself, because the pattern was too consistent, every access point, every device, every control channel aligning in one direction, and it was not theirs. Danielle rested her hands again, fingers lightly touching the edge of the table, grounded, composed, as if nothing that had just happened required her to stand or assert anything further, because the system had already done it for her. The chairman finally pulled his eyes away from the screen and looked directly at her, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her seat, but at her presence, measuring it against everything he thought he knew about authority, and finding that it did not match his expectations at all. "Why did you not say something when you walked in?" he asked, and the question carried something new now, not accusation, not command, but something closer to realization forming too late. Danielle tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I did," she said, and the simplicity of the answer unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it forced him to reconsider every moment since she entered the room, every glance dismissed, every word ignored. The junior analyst lowered her eyes briefly, replaying it in her mind, the quiet presence, the lack of interruption, the confidence that did not demand recognition but existed regardless of it. She understood now that silence had been the statement, and they had all chosen not to hear it. A soft sound came from the main display again, not a notification this time, but a system progression, the governance panel updated once more, the suspended status is now accompanied by a secondary label, pending reassignment. The phrase moved across the screen with clinical precision, stripping away not just access, but identity within the structure they had built their authority around. One executive exhaled sharply, pushing his chair back as he stood. "You cannot do this." Without a vote, he said, grasping for the last rule he believed still applied. Danielle's eyes moved to him, calm, unshaken. "The vote already happened," she replied, and the room felt that sentence more than it heard it, because the system behind her confirmed it. Time-stamped approvals, majority override, digital signatures that carried legal weight beyond anything spoken in that room. The chairman's hand rested on the table now, no longer as a symbol of control, but as something to steady himself against. "This was not on the schedule," he said quietly, and for the first time his voice did not try to rise above the moment, it sat within it, acknowledging the shift he could no longer deny. Danielle allowed a brief pause, not to build tension, but to let understanding settle where resistance had been. "It was," she said, her voice even, "you just removed it before you understood it." The words landed with finality, not dramatic, not loud, just complete, and in that moment the room did not need another explanation, because everything that had happened since the beginning aligned into a single, undeniable sequence. They had not been interrupted, they had been tested, and they had failed without ever realizing the stakes. The building officer near the wall lowered his gaze, no longer observing a situation, but witnessing an outcome, and around the table, the individuals who once defined leadership sat in a space that no longer recognized them as such, while Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she had always been, not elevated by the moment, but revealed by it, the authority they had tried to remove now standing quietly as the only one that had ever belonged there. The room did not argue with her last statement, it absorbed it, slowly, heavily, like a truth that arrived too late to be negotiated, and for a brief moment no one reached for their devices, no one tried to interrupt the system still running behind her, because something deeper had begun to settle in, not just the loss of control, but the realization of how easily they had given it up. Danielle Brooks remained still, her presence no longer questioned, but now quietly understood, and in that stillness something shifted inside her as well, not visible to the room, not expressed in movement, but internal, a memory rising uninvited yet perfectly timed, because moments like this never stand alone, they echo. Years earlier, a different room, smaller, less polished, fluorescent lights instead of glass walls. Danielle at 25, seated at the edge of a long table, her notes prepared, her ideas ready, her voice measured, until someone had said, almost casually, "This part is for senior leadership, you can step out," and she had, not because she agreed, but because she understood what resistance would cost at that time. She remembered the walk down the hallway, the quiet, the way her reflection looked in the dark glass of the office doors, composed on the outside, but carrying something sharper underneath, not anger, not yet, but clarity forming. She had not forgotten the tone, the assumption, the way authority had been defined not by capability but by perception, and now, standing in a room that mirrored that moment in structure but not in outcome, Danielle let the memory pass through her without holding on to it, because this was not about revisiting the past, it was about closing it, back in the present. One of the executives finally spoke again, but his voice had changed, stripped of certainty. "We did not have all the information," he said, as if explanation could soften consequence. Danielle looked at him briefly, then away, not dismissing him, but not granting the statement any weight either. Because the absence of information had not been the problem, it had been the assumption built in its place. The chairman exhaled slowly, running a hand along the edge of the table, grounding himself in something tangible as the intangible slipped away. "If this is an audit," he said carefully, "then there are procedures," and even as he said it, the words felt like they belonged to a system that no longer recognized him. Danielle's gaze returned to him, steady, unwavering. "There are," she replied, "and you just watch them begin." The clarity in her tone did not escalate, it settled, like a final line drawn where there had been none before. The main display updated again, not with alerts this time, but with structure, a new hierarchy forming in real time, roles shifting, placeholders appearing where authority had been removed. The room watched it happen without interruption, because there was nothing left to interrupt with. The junior analyst sat back slowly, her earlier tension replaced with a quiet understanding that she was witnessing more than a meeting. She was watching a reset, one that did not require volume or force, only precision and timing. Danielle's hands rested lightly again, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried something different, not just authority, but completion, the kind that comes when something long unresolved finally reaches its end point. And in that room, where minutes earlier she had been told to leave, Danielle Brooks did not stand, did not move toward the door, because she had never been the one out of place. The room had simply taken time to realize it. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it had crossed into something irreversible, not loud, not chaotic, but complete, like a door that had quietly closed without anyone noticing until they tried to walk back through it. Danielle Brooks did not rush the moment, she did not fill the silence with explanation or justification, because everything that needed to be understood was already visible, already unfolding in front of them. The system behind her continued its quiet progression, roles dissolving, permissions redistributing, a structure being rewritten in real time without a single raised voice. One of the executives reached for his tablet again, slower this time, almost cautious, as if the device itself might respond differently depending on how he touched it, but the result was the same: access denied. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling in a way that sounded less like frustration and more like realization. The chairman remained standing, but his presence no longer anchored the room. It hovered, uncertain, disconnected from the authority it once represented. "You planned this," he said finally, not as an accusation, but as a recognition forming too late to change anything. Danielle met his gaze, steady, unflinching. "No," she replied, her voice calm, precise. "I prepared for it, and the distinction mattered, because planning implies reaction, but preparation implies expectation. And expectation meant she had seen this coming long before she stepped into that room." A quiet murmur moved across the table, not coordinated, not intentional, just the natural response of people adjusting to a reality they could no longer deny. The junior analyst looked down at her screen again, then back at Danielle, and this time there was no hesitation, only clarity. She understood now that what she was witnessing was not disruption, it was correction. A system responding to something it had been waiting to address. The technician stepped further away from his console, no longer pretending to monitor it, because it had made its alignment clear. It was no longer his to control. Danielle's hands moved once more, not to command, but to confirm. A final input, small, deliberate, and the main display responded instantly. The governance panel clearing, replaced by a single structured summary. Executive leadership reset complete, interim authority reassigned. Effective immediately. The words did not carry emotion, they did not need to, they carried finality. One of the board members let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "This cannot just happen in 8 minutes, he said, and the statement lingered in the air, because it revealed something deeper than disbelief. It revealed a misunderstanding of time itself. Danielle's eyes moved to him, and for the first time there was the faintest trace of something beneath her composure, not amusement, not satisfaction, but something closer to truth being acknowledged. "It did not," she said, her voice even. "It took years," and that was the moment the room understood that what they had experienced as sudden had actually been building long before any of them noticed. Every assumption, every overlooked detail, every quiet dismissal layering into a structure that had finally reached its breaking point. The chairman lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition of something he could not undo. And when he looked back up, the question he had been holding shifted, no longer about control, but about consequence. Danielle remained seated, exactly where she had been since the beginning, not elevated by the outcome, but aligned with it, because this was never about proving who she was, it was about revealing who they had chosen to ignore. And in that room, where authority had once been assumed without question, it now existed only where it had always belonged, quiet, prepared, and impossible to remove. No one reached for authority anymore, not even out of habit, because the system had made something unmistakably clear. Authority was not something they could reclaim by speaking louder or standing taller. It had already moved, already reassigned itself with a precision that left no room for negotiation. Danielle Brooks did not rise from her seat, she did not circle the table or command the room with movement, because movement would have suggested effort, and this moment required none. The chairman slowly pulled his chair back and sat down, not as a gesture of defeat, but as an acknowledgement of reality settling into place, a reality that no longer responded to his voice. "What happens now?" he asked, and the question did not carry resistance, it carried consequence. Danielle looked at him, then at the others, her gaze steady, inclusive, not excluding anyone, but no longer seeking approval from any of them. Now, she said calmly, the company operates without bias at the top, and the words did not accuse directly, but they landed exactly where they needed to, because everyone in that room understood what had just been exposed, not through argument, not through confrontation, but through their own actions. The junior analyst lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back up, her expression no longer uncertain, but resolved, as if she had just learned something she would carry for the rest of her career. One of the former executives leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, not in authority, but in reflection. You could have walked in and introduced yourself, he said, quieter now, and Danielle let a brief pause settle before answering, not to create tension, but to let the truth arrive fully formed. And you could have asked, she replied, her voice even, before deciding who belonged. The room absorbed that differently than anything else she had said, because it did not rely on systems or authority, it relied on something simpler, something they had overlooked entirely. The main display shifted once more, not with alerts or removals, but with a new agenda, clean, structured, aligned with the updated leadership framework. Danielle's name remained at the top, not as a participant, but as the one who defined the session itself, and for the first time, no one questioned it, no one challenged it, because the room had already learned what happened when they did. The building officer quietly stepped out, closing the door behind him without instruction, because there was nothing left to enforce, only something to understand. Danielle finally moved her hands away from the tablet and placed them flat on the table, not claiming space, but confirming it. This meeting continues, she said, and the words carried no aggression, no demand, only certainty, and slowly, almost instinctively, people adjusted in their seats, not as leaders reclaiming control, but as participants. Recognizing it had never been theirs to define, the chairman glanced once more at the screen, then back at Danielle, and this time there was no confusion left in his expression, only clarity shaped by consequence, because the truth had already been delivered without volume, without spectacle, and without reversal. Danielle Brooks had not taken power in that room, she had revealed it, and in doing so, she had left no space for it to be misunderstood again. The room did not return to what it had been, it reassembled into something quieter, more precise, as if every word now had to earn its place before being spoken. Danielle Brooks remained seated at the end of the table, not elevated, not distant, but undeniably central, and the people around her adjusted accordingly, not through instruction, but through awareness. The chairman glanced once more at the updated agenda on the screen, then back at Danielle, and this time when he spoke, the tone had shifted completely. Proceed, he said, not as a command, but as recognition, and that single word marked the full transition of authority in the room. Danielle gave a small nod, not acknowledging him as superior, but acknowledging the moment itself. Then she reached for her tablet again, not to override, not to correct, but to begin. We will start with the Q3 restructuring projections, she said, her voice steady, clear, and now fully accepted without resistance. The same data that had been displayed earlier returned to the main screen, but it no longer felt like background noise. It felt aligned, purposeful, part of a system that was now functioning as intended. One of the former executives leaned forward slightly, instinctively preparing to contribute, then hesitated, catching himself, recalibrating his role in real time. Danielle noticed, but did not call attention to it. She simply continued. You will notice the variance in the Midwest division, she said, guiding the discussion with precision, not asserting dominance, but establishing direction, and gradually, the room followed, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. The junior analyst began typing again, this time without hesitation, her notes more focused, her posture more grounded, as if she had stepped into a clearer version of the environment around her. Another member of the board spoke up carefully, offering input not as authority, but as contribution, and Danielle listened, not dismissing, not correcting immediately, but evaluating, creating space for engagement that had been missing before. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. The meeting had not just resumed, it had transformed, because now every voice in the room existed within a structure that had been recalibrated to remove assumption, to remove unchecked bias, to remove the illusion that authority could exist without accountability. Danielle paused briefly as the discussion reached a natural break, her gaze moving across the table. Not searching for validation, but confirming alignment. We move forward from here, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything that had come before, because it was not about what had happened, it was about what would not happen again. The chairman nodded once, slowly, fully aware now of the shift that had taken place, not just in the system, but in himself, because for the first time he was not leading the room, he was part of it, and around the table. The others followed, not with forced agreement, but with quiet acceptance. Danielle Brooks did not need to remind them of what had occurred, she did not need to reinforce her position, because the room itself had become the proof, and as the meeting continued, structured, focused, and undeniably different, one truth settled deeper than any policy or protocol could enforce: authority had not been taken, it had been revealed, and now that it had been seen clearly, it would never again be mistaken for anything less. The meeting did not slow down, but it changed in a way that no one could ignore. Every contribution now carried intention, every word measured against a standard that had not existed when the room believed it was in control. Danielle Brooks guided the discussion forward without raising her voice, without asserting dominance. Yet every decision aligned with her direction, as if the system itself had extended beyond the screens and into the behavior of the people around her. The projections shifted on the display: regional performance breakdowns, operational inefficiencies, strategic corrections, all presented with clarity that demanded focus rather than assumption. One of the former executives spoke again, this time carefully. If we reallocate resources to the Midwest Division, we might stabilize the decline within 2 quarters. His tone no longer carried entitlement, only contribution. Danielle nodded slightly, acknowledging the input. Support it with data, she replied, and the exchange felt different from anything that had happened earlier, because it was no longer about who had the authority to speak, it was about what deserved to be said. The junior analyst quickly pulled up supporting figures, her fingers moving with confidence, no longer second-guessing her place in the room, because the hierarchy had shifted from position to value. The chairman listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, simply absorbing the flow of the discussion as it moved forward under a structure he had not defined but now understood. Danielle allowed the conversation to expand, guiding it only when necessary, creating space where clarity could replace assumption, and as the minutes passed, the earlier tension no longer lingered, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been resolved at its root. The system update behind them remained steady, no new alerts, no disruptions, only a stable framework reflecting the decisions being made in real time. One of the board members leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested something heavier had lifted, not the loss of authority, but the weight of carrying it without question. Danielle paused again, letting the discussion settle into a natural rhythm, then spoke with quiet precision. What happened here today is not an exception, she said, her gaze steady across the table. It is a correction, and the room absorbed that differently than before. Because now they understood the difference. This was not a moment of disruption, it was a standard being set, one that would continue beyond this meeting, beyond this room, beyond the individuals sitting in it. The chairman nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition, because for the first time he saw the structure clearly, not as something he controlled, but as something that required responsibility he had overlooked. Danielle's presence did not demand acknowledgement anymore, it had already been established, and as the discussion moved forward, one final realization settled quietly across the room: the authority they had once assumed was never truly theirs to hold without question, and now that it had been redefined, it would not return to what it had been before, because the system, the structure, and the people within it had all been changed by a truth that no longer needed to be spoken aloud to be understood. The meeting did not end with a dramatic conclusion, it settled into completion the way something precise always does, quietly, firmly, without needing to announce itself. The final slide faded from the main display, replaced by a clean summary of decisions that had been aligned, approved, and understood by everyone in the room. Danielle Brooks closed her tablet with a soft, deliberate motion, not as a signal of authority, but as a marker that what needed to be done had been done. No one rushed to stand, no one reached for their devices in distraction, because the room itself had changed in a way that made movement feel intentional rather than automatic. The chairman looked across the table once more, his gaze steady, not searching for control, but acknowledging the structure that now existed without his command. "We will implement immediately," he said, and this time the statement carried weight because it aligned with something real, not assumed. Danielle gave a slight nod, not approving, not confirming, simply recognizing that the room had finally reached the point it should have started from. One of the board members gathered his notes slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more aware, as if he understood that position alone would no longer define his role moving forward. The junior analyst saved her work and looked up, her expression thoughtful, grounded, carrying a clarity she had not had when the meeting began, because she had seen something few people ever witnessed, the difference between assumed authority and actual power. Danielle stood then, not abruptly, not to dominate the space, but because the moment had naturally reached its end, her presence unchanged from when she first entered, calm, composed, unshaken by everything that had unfolded. The room followed her movement instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of alignment. Chairs shifted softly, papers gathered, but no one spoke over the quiet that held the space together. Danielle looked toward the door for a brief second, then back at the table, her gaze moving across each person, not to judge, not to remind, but to leave something behind without needing to say it directly. And then she spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying the final weight of everything that had happened without needing to repeat any of it. "You did not lose power today," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "You revealed how you were using it." The sentence did not rise, it anchored, deeper than any policy or protocol could reach. Because it did not belong to the system behind her, it belonged to the people in front of her. The room did not respond immediately, not because they disagreed, but because they understood, and understanding like that does not require a reply, it requires reflection. Danielle turned then and walked toward the door, her steps measured, unhurried, not leaving the room as someone dismissed, but as someone who had never needed permission to be there. The door opened quietly, the hallway beyond unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside that room, everything had shifted, not through force, not through noise, but through clarity that had finally been seen. And as the door closed behind her, the people left at the table did not speak right away, because the silence now carried something different, not tension, not uncertainty, but the undeniable presence of a truth that would follow them long after they left that room, a truth that no longer needed to be questioned, because it had already been proven.